So although one of the things that Van Evra wants to warn us against is thinking of death as a state of experiencelessness, a state of no experience, no consciousness, basically a state of nothingness, that is not true of anything. That is, death is not a state of anything, he says in the beginning. Yet, that notion of experiencelessness does have some conceptual function, and it's notion of a function or an ordering function of a limit. That is the dominant idea in this second part of the essay. Death cannot be seen as a state. There's no state of death in the sense of state of experiencelessness or state of nothingness. And in fact, he says, really, to say that death is a limit is not to say that some limit exists. That is, that the reality of the limit is not really something that he's really interested in establishing. And he says that, well, how do we think of death as a limit? Well, think of it in terms of the way that the notion of a limit, let's say a limit of a series, the function that plays in mathematics or science. And he cites Newton's first law of motion on page 172 at the bottom. Quote, he says, if external forces F acting on a body whose momentum along a straight line is mv are zero, then the time rate of change in mv, which may happen to be zero in the limiting case, so that the body is at rest relative to that line, is also zero. And he says, formulated in this manner, the axiom postulates a limiting motion, that is, a state in which a body is under the influence of no forces at all. To ask whether there are really bodies in such a state is to miss the significance of the concept entirely. That is, the notion of a body that is subject to no forces at all, a physical body of any sort, physical thing, a material thing, in the physics sense of body, or physical thing. The notion that whether there is actually any body at any time that's not subject to some force or another, there probably isn't. Just as he says, there's probably no body whose temperature is absolute zero. But those things can be conceived of as limiting cases. That is, a body may at no time be really, there may be no body that's subject to no forces whatsoever, but a body can get closer and closer to it, just as it may be that there's no possibility of a physical body being at a temperature of absolute zero, but we can get closer and closer and closer to it in this asymptotic way. Like the relationship between some curves and lines, where the space between them, according to the curve, may get smaller and smaller, but never actually ever get to be zero. That is, that the curve and the line may never actually touch, but the space between them can be thought of as getting infinitely smaller. It's a very interesting concept in calculus, right? At least in my very limited understanding of the calculus. So death can be thought of as an ordering function in that way, is that we never really get there, in the sense that in our experience, we never actually experience the limit of death, but in our lives, as our lives move forward, we get closer and closer to it. And this idea of death as a limiting function of my experience, that is never something that will be actually part of my experience, but something that I can conceive of as being a limit to my experience. And this notion of the limit can act in actually quite practical ways. I may slow down my car because I'm aware of my life as having a limit, being limited by death. He mentions the Kubler-Ross thesis of the different stages of grieving, or different stages of response to realizing that one's going to die soon. He says, this is on page 174 at the bottom, the second and purest example of how we react to death has to do with the reactions of those who are aware that their death is imminent. A recent psychiatric study, and that's Kubler-Ross's famous On Death and Dying, suggests that individuals react to impending death in fairly regular ways. Each of the stages through which such individuals pass denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, the individual conceives of death not in itself, but as it bears on him while he is still alive. Death to these individuals is something to be avoided, to blame others for, to reject others in the face of, while it steadfastly resists conceptualization itself. That is, death, our awareness of death as limit actually does affect the way we live. However, this resisting conceptualization itself, that is, because death is always, let's say, the next thing in my experience, it's always in the future, which is something I think that Evra doesn't really talk about sufficiently, because he doesn't talk about death as a time limit or a temporal limit. He thinks of the analogies in the terms of visual limit or spatial limit or mathematical limit, but really death is, in our experience, is a temporal limit. It's a temporal limit of our lives. It's a terminus, the temporal end of our lives. We're always getting closer to it, and sometimes in our experience, in danger or illness, we get very close to it. But it's not something that actually we ever reach, in the sense of, in our experience, we could ever reach, because we could never actually experience it, because when we reach it, it's the end of our experience, so we get closer and closer to it, or we can think of ourselves as getting closer and closer to it without ever actually reaching it ourselves. Of course, that doesn't mean we live forever. What it means is that our lives are, again, finite and limited, but that we never actually experience the limit itself. So I think the proposal here is that, as he says on the end of the section 2 on page 175, in sum, then, we have seen that, as Wittgenstein suggested, death is like a limit in the sense of being an experientially unattainable bound. But more than this, death is like a limit in deriving what significance it has from the role it plays as an ordering function with respect to the experiencing beings which it limits. That is, death is an unexperienciable bound, yet its significance in life to us is as an ordering function. That is, as that which we can think of ourselves as getting ever and ever closer to and limiting our lives without actually attaining it in our experience.